Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. It seems like it's been ages since I filmed, even though I only filmed last week. I've had such a busy week and it just feels like it's been like a month long. This is definitely getting to be my favourite part of the week. So my nan actually suggested this case to me, which I was made up about, because it's so nice when you see family members and they're enjoying your videos and they're like, oh, did you hear about this one? And it's great. So this story takes place in Anglesey, which is about a 2-hour drive from me, and it's in Wales. And we actually used to go on a holiday there when we were little. We used to go camping a lot, so we didn't go exactly where this story in particular took place, but it wasn't far at all from there. So this town has a really long name, which I'm going to try and pronounce just for fun because I've never tried to pronounce it before. You ready? It's oh no, I know from my friend that like a double L is usually a cl sound, so it's like Llanfairpwll, Llanfairpwll, Gwyngelyn, Gary Chwn, Drop.
Welcome to the EE voicemail.
Can you or Lars please pronounce that big long word?
Yeah, allowed to do now.
Thank you.
I want to put a disclaimer out there.
Okay.
If I get this wrong, I don't want to be harassed about it online.
Okay.
Ready?
Yeah.
Llanfairpwll plus Gwyngelyn Gogeres when dropper Llansilio go.
Okay. Right, that's long. Thank you so much. Right, so that is the name of the place. So this place is a super small, peaceful, calm village. There's barely any kind of criminal behaviour and there's quite a lot of elderly people there too. So on the 25th of November 2001, there was a woman from Meals on Wheels, which is a company that delivers food to usually elderly or vulnerable people, just people that need a little bit more help. They take hot meals to them. So the Meals on Wheels customer was a woman called Mabel Lation, and she was 90 years old and she was a really sweet lady. She was quite reserved, but everyone in the town knew of her. She'd been married to a vet, but her husband had passed away, so she was a widow and she was living by herself, and they never had any children. And besides her eyesight and hearing deteriorating a bit, she was in really good health, and eyesight and hearing going is, you know, expected when you're 90, so she was doing really well for her age. So around 12:30, the Meals on Wheels lady comes to her front door and she starts to knock to deliver Mabel's lunch, but there was no answer at the door. So this was kind of expected of Mabel because she was hard of hearing. Sometimes she'd just be sat in a chair watching telly, she wouldn't hear people knock. So the woman carried on knocking, and then after a little while she was a bit concerned, so she went round the back. Maybe if she knocked on the back door, Mabel would hear her a bit more clearly. Maybe she was just too far away from the front door in the house. Unfortunately, when she got round to the back of the house, one of the panels in her back door had been completely smashed in. It was like French doors. I'll try and put a picture up of what I mean, but the bottom panel had been smashed in and someone would have been able to get through that panel. Like, it was big enough for someone to crawl through, basically. The lady rang the police straight away and said, I think there's been a break-in, explained what had happened, that she was making a delivery to Mabel's house, and obviously she was really concerned. This lady lived by herself and someone, it looked like, had got into the house. So a few police officers came pretty much straight away and knocked on the door just to see if hopefully she would answer, but she didn't. So they made their way around the back of the house and saw the door for themselves. The officer that arrived, Alison, took all the remaining glass out of the panel just so she was able to go in safely and not kind of brush up against the glass that was already there. Alison removed all the glass that was still in the panel and put it in a little pile by the back door just so they could come back to it if they needed to. The first room she went into was, I think, the dining room, and she said nothing looked out of the ordinary. It was pretty empty, just immaculate, nothing wrong with it. And then she started to see a kind of red glow from another room, so she followed that glow thinking it's a light, maybe Mabel's in there. So she went through and that was the living room. Some reports say it's from the fire, some reports say it was from a light, but either way there was a red glow in that room. And when she went into that room, she saw someone sitting in a chair with a blanket pulled up over their head. She could just see hair sticking up at the top. When Alison pulled the blanket back down off Mabel's face, she could see immediately that Mabel had passed away. And then when she pulled it down a little bit further, she could see that she had lots and lots of stab wounds all over her neck, her shoulders and her chest. Obviously now this isn't just a break-in, it's a murder scene, so Alison called for backup. Detectives and the forensics team turned up. They all had all the forensic suits on. They didn't want to contaminate anything. They made sure that they kind of kept everywhere as close to as it was as they could, just to get a feel for what had happened at first. because obviously this is really out of the ordinary, especially for that kind of place. Like, you wouldn't expect something like that to happen anywhere, never mind somewhere that's so peaceful and calm and people go there for their holiday. Detectives said that the scene was like a shrine. There were pokers laid out in crosses, there was candlesticks, and then obviously there was Mabel's body, who had been stabbed multiple times. But what they noticed was that there wasn't a lot of blood in this scene. She was bleeding because she had been stabbed, but there wasn't as much blood that was usually at a scene like this. There was also a milk pan with a package inside that was wrapped in lots and lots of newspaper and covered in blood, and no one knew what that was going to be, but they obviously thought it was going to be something nasty considering how the rest of the place had been laid out. So at this time, the police only told the community that an old lady had been stabbed in a house and passed away. So they knew that there was a murder on the loose, but they didn't actually tell them the full extent as to what had happened, and I'm going to keep that as well until later on in the video. And they did this because they thought everyone would already be terrified, and they were. As soon as it went dark, everyone stayed in. Literally no one went out to do anything. If they had to go to the shops at any point, they'd go in pairs. Everyone would be taking someone with them to do just normal everyday things. Elderly people didn't leave the house at all. It was so scary for everyone in that community. Apparently places that sold things like chains and bolts and locks for the door, they all just sold out because everyone was just taking extra measures to make sure that no one could break into their house and do the same. And the police were so sure that this murderer would repeat their crime because they had no idea who it could be. No one knew who could have done this or who would want to do this to this old lady. She didn't know anyone, she didn't have any enemies, obviously, she just kind of kept to herself. So it was really puzzling as to who would have done this, but they thought because they didn't have any leads, they probably weren't going to catch them very fast, so they thought that they would definitely do it again. So the forensics team were looking around the house for any kind of clues that they could, and unfortunately they didn't find any fingerprints. Whoever had been in there had worn gloves. They found shoe prints on the glass from the broken window, so that was something. There was also a shoe print on a mossy piece of slate that they could use. They also found denim fibres on the glass that was around the door that had been broken in. And they also found these fibres on bits of furniture that the killer had brushed past. The post-mortem showed that Mabel had been stabbed 22 times, and she had wounds all over her arms that she'd held her hands up like that trying to defend herself. And she also had slices in her elbows and behind her legs, and they didn't really know what these were for. And the way that they bled out showed that Mabel was actually dead when these cuts had been made, so that was puzzling as to why she had these marks on her. So the bloodstain samples were sent off to the lab, and one of them had Mabel's DNA in it, which was expected, but it also had someone else's DNA in it. They weren't 100% sure that this was going to be the murderer's DNA, but they thought as Mabel didn't really ever have any visitors, it was pretty likely that it was going to be theirs. The DNA sample that had been found along with Mabel's gave off a male component, so they were pretty sure that they were looking for a man at this point. But they did want to interview everyone in the village because it was the place where everyone knew everyone, so they wanted to know what everyone knew. Police knew that whoever did this to Mabel probably knew that she lived by herself and knew her as well. That pointed to the fact that it was probably someone who lived there, visited there, or, you know, had some connection to that place. This was terrifying because whoever had done this, the community all probably knew them. It was probably, you know, a family member or a friend. So they made a criminal profile for who they thought they might be looking for, which was a male between 18 and 60, and they were most likely to be a loner, just someone who was a bit of a misfit, and they thought possibly they would have early stages of schizophrenia. So while they spoke to everyone in the village, they took DNA from every male who fit that thing. They didn't go like, you're a loner, please can we have a swab. It was every male between 18 and 60. They just took DNA from everyone just to be on the safe side. Then 1 week after the murder, something really strange happened. There'd been a suicide on Britannia Bridge, which was 37-year-old David Griffiths. He'd poured petrol on himself, set himself alight and jumped off the bridge. When the police arrived at the scene, they went to the top of the bridge to see where he jumped from, and on the floor there were scratches of crosses. They thought maybe this wasn't a suicide, maybe this is the murderer again, because Mabel had pokers that were set out in the shape of crosses when she was found. Or maybe this is a suicide of the person who killed Mabel and he's feeling guilty. And a lot of people thought that was what had happened. Everyone thought maybe he couldn't deal with the guilt anymore, so he'd thrown himself off the bridge. So they really wanted to look into David, and they visited his parents' home where he'd lived. They went to his house and tried to see if he had any of the shoes that fit the ones that were found at the scene, and he didn't. They tried to look at the ones that were found on his body, and again, not a match. They also found a poem which was an extract from the Bible, and the poem was about a heart. That will make sense soon. But it made the police very suspicious. They took items from David's home to examine just to see if they could link him in any way to Mabel, but they couldn't, so he was dropped. Then the police wanted to look into the murder weapon, which was a 6-inch blade. So it's a pretty big knife to be just carrying around, so they thought maybe this came from someone who uses knives as part of their job. They wanted to look at people who worked in meat and fish factories, but a lot of these people lived abroad or worked abroad or just moved around for their jobs constantly, so it was really hard to track these people down. A lot of police flew abroad to go and question people who'd moved home since working in the village, just in case they knew anything or maybe they could pull a suspect from one of those people. And again, that didn't really lead to anything. No one was showing anything suspicious. At this point, none of the DNA was matching the DNA that was found on the scene. No one was showing any signs of being suspicious. It was just coming to dead ends constantly. But what they did have was the shoe print of the murderer, so they started to look into that more. So soles on shoes can be put onto loads of different designs. So what the police needed to do was to find which top the shoe was coming from. As in like the bit that covers your foot, they needed to find the top bit. When they ran the shoe print through a database, it came up with absolutely nothing. But then after lots and lots of research, they actually found the shoe that it was from. So they found that the prints were from a pair of Levi trainers, and luckily this particular design hadn't sold very well at all. So they needed to find out which shops close to the village sold these trainers and then track down who bought them. They found that only 53 pairs were sold in the nearest shop, and most of them were with cards. That's really easy to track down, but then some of them were paid for with cash, which is harder to track. But even with all these findings, the police were still at a dead end. They weren't coming to anything right now. So they thought about what they told the public, and even though it's absolutely horrendous what the public already knew, obviously if anyone is killed, it's horrible. But they thought maybe if they told them the full extent as to what had happened or what had been found on that day, then maybe someone would have more answers. And there were a lot of rumours as well going on at this time about what was found on the day. They kind of had the suspicions that they weren't being told the full story, but police thought that maybe it was time to actually set the record straight and tell them exactly what had been found. They decided to release this by having a reconstruction on a programme called Crime Watch, which I'm not sure is around anymore, but it was when I was little because I used to love it. It would just have reconstructions of crimes that were committed, and there was a number afterwards to say, you know, if you know anything about this, please ring this number, and it would try and encourage people to come forward if they'd seen anything. So what was shown on Crime Watch was what the community didn't know. So Mabel had been stabbed, that was all true, but her chest cavity had been completely opened and her heart had been removed. The top of the heart had been cut out and it looked as though it had been squeezed and drained of all the blood. So the blood had been squeezed into this milk pan. Then detectives found that there was a bloody imprint of lips on the side of the pan. So someone had drank Mabel's blood out of the pan, which is why there wasn't much blood at the scene. And the cuts on her elbows and behind her legs was someone trying to drain the blood from her. Just dead quick, when I was researching this, I realised that there was nowhere that said that they'd taken a swab from the pan because someone's mouth had been on it, so I would have thought that they'd be able to kind of take DNA from that, but I didn't see that reported anywhere. I don't know, maybe I'm being an idiot, maybe that's not how things work, but I would have thought they'd have done that. Maybe they did and it just wasn't reported on. I don't know. I just found it really strange that that would be my first thing, like someone's slobbered on that, let's get it. As I said, they have Crime Watch because they try and encourage people to come forward about information they might have, and it worked. They got so many calls, but one in particular was a massive interest to them. So this person had been at a house party with a boy who was acting really strangely. This boy had been trying to get a German girl who was an exchange student to bite him, saying that he wanted to be immortal and if she bit him or he bit her, I don't really know how it worked, but there was some biting going on and he was trying to get bitten so he could be immortal, and it got to the point where he was actually like physically restraining her, trying to get her to bite him. So the police were called and he was taken and kind of kept overnight somewhere. He wasn't arrested or anything, I don't think, but he was just let off in the morning, like, don't be weird, go on, So yeah, nothing really came of that, but obviously this student had seen this story and thought, I think I've got me suspicions as to who it might be because this happened. So the person who'd been trying to get everyone to bite him was called Matthew Hardman, and he was a 17-year-old boy who lived in the village. He was an art student and they weren't really suspicious of him to begin with, but obviously they have to look at every single lead and they had to rule him out. So they went to his art college just to see if they could have a look at any of the paintings that he'd done, and they found one of an angel with an open rib cage and it was holding a heart. So they weren't straight away really suspicious of this either. I don't think if you have an interest in something it automatically means you're going to go off and kill someone. And I think they shared that view. So Matthew had already spoken to officers about Mabel's death because they interviewed everyone in the community, but because he was 17 they hadn't taken his DNA because the profile was for anyone between the ages of 18 and 60 I think. But either way, 18 was the starting age, so that didn't include Matthew in that. But on January the 5th they went to visit him and they started asking him about the girl that he tried to get to bite him at the party, and he was just saying, you know, oh I'm sorry, like yeah I was just lost it that night. And then they started turning the conversation to Mabel and they asked if he knew her, and he said, no, I don't know Mabel, I've never been to that house. But as the detectives were speaking to Matthew, his mum was in and out, you know, probably making tea and stuff for them, and she was like, no, you do know Mabel, you deliver a paper to her. So the detectives were like, you didn't tell us that? He'd been delivering papers for years to a lot of houses, but he said that he hadn't been a paper boy for 3 years. But again, his mum jumps in and says, no, you haven't done it for 3 months. And then they thought maybe he'd got years and months kind of mixed up, you know, as a slip of the tongue. But again, he was kind of lying about this and they were getting more suspicious. So then they said, well, because you are a paper boy, that means you've been up to that residence, so could we please take a look at your shoes, because we've found a shoe print and we just need to rule you out because we're ruling everyone out who's ever been up to that house. So Matthew agreed and took them up to get his shoes, and when they saw his shoes they saw the exact pair of shoes that they'd been looking for, which were the Levi trainers. But even this didn't completely link Matthew to the murder. One of the detectives as they were leaving though said, I think we've got our guy, but they still needed more evidence. So they needed an alibi from Matthew, and Matthew said that he'd been with someone on the night of the murder, but it was the same person that had actually rang in to tip the police off about him trying to bite the girl at the party, or I can't remember who bit who, but him being weird with the girl at the party, it was the same person who had called, and he just said, no, that's not true, I wasn't with Matthew that night, he's making it up. And they had Matthew followed by a surveillance team, which are just people who can blend into kind of everyday life, you'd never know they were there. And Matthew was the only person who was going out after dark. And there was meant to be a murderer on the loose, and he was just confidently walking around like nothing was happening. They then got confirmation from the lab that Matthew's shoes were the exact same prints as the footprints found at the scene of the crime. So Matthew was arrested on January the 8th in 2002, and the police had 72 hours to either charge him or to let him go. So again, they searched Matthew's room and house and they took his computer and they were able to trace everything that he'd ever done with the computer. There was a lot of sites of, you know, gore, violence, there was vampire sites and just dark things on there. They also found lots of magazines and books on Satan, the devil, things like that. And again, I'm just going to say, just because you're into stuff like that doesn't mean that you're going to go out and hurt someone. But the books and the computer history wasn't the only thing that made Matthew look really, really bad. They found one of Matthew's jackets and inside it was a 6-inch knife. They took some blue jeans and they also found a meat cleaver that was found wrapped up in a cagoule, which also had some latex gloves inside. These latex gloves were unworn, but still it looks suspicious with everything else. Meanwhile, Matthew's being interviewed and he's still not admitting to anything, and the police still need some more evidence to be able to charge him. Like, I would have definitely thought all of this would have been enough, but apparently it wasn't. Matthew had been interviewed for over 2 days now. He wasn't cracking, he wasn't admitting to anything, he was saying he was innocent. And meanwhile in the lab they were trying to match the DNA they'd found to Matthew, and they were really trying to fast track that. And just 2 hours before they would have had to let Matthew go, they found out that the DNA was a match, which placed Matthew at the scene of the crime and also proved that all of the other things that they'd found wasn't just a coincidence. His trial was in July in 2002, and the prosecutors said that Matthew was probably fully aware that Mabel lived there by herself and he'd probably targeted her. He'd found out through delivering a paper and talking to her a few times that she couldn't hear very well, and he probably used that to his advantage. On the night of the 24th of November 2001, which was the day that Mabel was killed, Matthew had gone to Mabel's house, gone round the back, taken a bit of slate and put the back window through. He'd crawled into the house that way. Mabel didn't hear any of this. She was just sat in front of the telly, just having a nice chill. Matthew came up behind her and stabbed her in the shoulder blade, and then many more times. And it's said that one of the first stabs went through her heart and she died pretty quickly, but it doesn't make it any less sad. Because Mabel had died pretty early on, her blood wasn't pumping through her body anymore, and it was clear at this point that Matthew wanted her blood. That's what he killed her for. So he was trying to get blood from other ways, which is why he was cutting in her elbows and behind her legs. He was trying to get blood from those, but it wasn't working. So he decided to open up her chest really roughly and take out her heart. As we know, he squeezed the blood into a pan and then drank it, and then he wrapped the heart up in newspaper and left it in the pan. Then he set up his shrine with candles and pokers and covered Mabel with a blanket. So it's said that Matthew thought that he'd be immortal from drinking Mabel's blood, because that would mean he would be a vampire, and that's why he made all the crosses, because he wanted to kind of use them to see if it worked, and obviously it didn't work. He wasn't a vampire from drinking blood, he was just a murderer. It took 3 weeks at the trial for all the evidence to be heard, and nothing was looking good for Matthew. Even though he was very calm and collected during his trial, he didn't have a leg to stand on, basically. He tried to say that he only carried the knife after the murders as a kind of protection, which is why he felt it was safe to walk around by himself. But then when they looked at the knife even closer, they found that it had been washed in a dishwasher, so it was pretty clean. Then the handle of the knife had been broken, and they found his DNA in there and Mabel's as well, which was just even more evidence that he'd done this. His defence team were trying to say that the items from Mabel and Matthew's house were transported together and that they'd became contaminated, which is why her DNA was being shown on his stuff and his DNA was being shown on her stuff. And that was their whole point that they came up with. So the lab had to provide evidence that that wasn't true, even though they had been received at the same time. They were transported completely separately. I mean, I don't know how things like that are transported, but I'm imagining in different boxes. They weren't just, all flung in a bag and brought together. It was all done properly. So that evidence was brought in that was just not true. I think they were just trying to grab anything they could, because it wasn't looking good for Matthew at all. So the police were really worried about proving to the jury that this was Matthew who committed this crime. They thought the jury might think that it was a wrong accusation and that Matthew was completely innocent, especially with him still denying everything and acting so calm during the trial. But on the 2nd of August 2002, the jury surprised everyone, and after only 4 hours of deliberation, he was found guilty of the murder of Mabel Lation. Matthew was sentenced to life in prison, but because he was only 17, he got to serve a minimum of 12. He's served that by now, but he's still in there, and he may be eligible for parole if he ever admits to it, which he isn't doing. But even if he did confess, it doesn't necessarily mean he'll be released. I'll never understand people who take other people's lives. I understand to an extent when people kill for revenge or something's happened and they do this as a response. I don't agree with it at all, but I can see how your mind did that. He did this to an elderly lady who was just sat in her house, minding her own business, watching a bit of telly probably and having a cuppa. You can't get less provoked than that. And she looks so sweet too, her picture, she looks like she'd give you biscuits. I feel really sorry for her. I know she didn't have any children, but if she has any family, I'm thinking of them. It's just horrible what happened to her. I hope you enjoyed this case. I know it's a bit of a weird one, but I definitely needed to do a solved case after last week because I was still angry for 3 days after filming that. Thank you so much for watching this video. I upload a new true crime video every single Sunday. Please like and subscribe for more videos like this. Click the notification bell so you know when I've uploaded, and follow me on Twitter and Instagram, because if anything's late or postponed, then I will put it on there first. Or sometimes I'll just ask questions on what you all want to see. So yeah, follow me on there. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.